So good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Georgette Harrison, the Director of Clinical and Community Partnerships at the Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut. I also serve as the co-chair for Darien's Thriving Youth Task Force. We want to thank everyone who has logged on for tonight's community conversation about reimagining a healthier, happier way forward for our kids. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge the untimely passing of a Darien High School student and honor that this is a very difficult time for the student's family, his peers, and for the Darien community. And the fact that you as parents have made the time to join us during such a difficult moment speaks to your desire to want to support your children in every way possible. So we want to thank you for every effort that you make to help our kids feel loved and seen. As we move on to the trailer, I'd like you to remember that you're not alone as a parent. You are surrounded by other parents who also want their children to thrive. And in order to build a sense of community, we want you to please be active participants tonight by putting in your thoughts, questions, wonderings, anything in the chat. And to help every parent feel comfortable in asking their questions, the chat will only be seen by me and the members of our panel, and we will make every effort to answer your questions. We'll go ahead and show the trailer now.
How many of you come home from school and run outside and play?
Mondays I have hip hop.
Tuesdays I have this filming thing, basketball practice,
theater,
French
stop
tutor,
motion, filmmaking,
scent design.
It sounds like everyone's exhausted. Yes?
Childhood today is full of stuff that kids have to accomplish.
I don't have time to sit, I don't have time to think.
I want to go above and beyond. They're pushing us to be the best we can.
For the first time, we have created a world in which we are negating childhood.
How have we come to this point?
I walked to school at age 5. When you got to the corner, the crossing guard was a 10-year-old. Our younger son started asking if we would let him find his own way home on the subway. 2 days later, I was on the Today Show being grilled.
The worst mother in the world.
Crime is the lowest it's been for decades. Where did all this fear come from?
My mom always tried really hard to be a good parent.
When Savannah was little, I don't think she could take 2 steps without us saying, be careful. I raised my kids in a culture that's very directed.
We just kept pushing.
I was crying every night because if something was wrong, then something was wrong with me.
All right, is she ready? When you mortgage your kid's childhood, it's a debt that can never be repaid.
Play is practice in the whole range of skills that they need to become effective adults.
Let's do it again. That was so fun.
One of the things that's stopping parents from sending kids outside is the fear of getting arrested. Pass this law and reassure parents that we will not criminalize them for knowing when their kids are ready for some independence.
I feel like my kids missed out on something that kids shouldn't miss out on.
Get out, have fun.
What I really am trying to do is get parents to let go a little. All the worry in the world doesn't prevent death. It prevents life.
So one of the things that we wanted to do as we began the evening together is to have you put it in the chat. What is something that you do now as an adult for joy in your life? Or what is something that you did as a child that you wish your own child could enjoy more? You know, I'll share that one of the things that I used to do as a young child was to be able to go babysit at the neighbors, and probably at a much younger age than probably I had any business doing. But I know that that's probably not something that my child would be able or will be able to do as he or she get older. You know, I also had a lot of unstructured time. And even as a mom now, I very much feel the pressure to, structure every minute after school. That, this is valuable time, and, what is she going to do if sort of she's not being supervised because I'm working? And that's a very different way from the way that I grew up. So we're getting a few answers coming in. There's a couple of people talking about, sports. They like to play tennis, meet with a friend. And in childhood, she liked going over to a friend's house with minimal notice, whereas now it takes a lot more planning and coordination for play dates. One person wrote that she enjoyed biking to a friend's house and with friends for hours without anyone worrying. One person wrote that she loves taking long walks by herself, building a fort in the woods with friends. Another mention for recreational sports, time with friends. And another person wrote that as a child, he used to go outside and play and then come home when the street lights came on. And that was always the indicator that we needed to go home. And as an adult, what he's doing for joy is volunteering at the different agencies around him. Thank you everyone for sharing that with us. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Joining us tonight is Genevieve Eason. When Genevieve's academically successful daughter suffered from serious mental illness in high school, Genevieve became a grassroots activist in her community of Wilton, fighting to restore free play in childhood. And as a community organizer and youth mental health advocate, Genevieve worked to shift the definition of success and lessen the pressure on kids. And she was most recently the executive director of the Wilton Youth Council and one of the leaders of the town's Free Play Matters task force. We also have Dr. Michael Hines with us tonight, served as the superintendent of schools in his hometown district of Patchogue, Medford in Long Island. And his mission is to spread the message of the importance of holistic approach to educating children. He emphasized the importance of play, recess in schools, mental health, yoga, and mindfulness in the classroom. And he's also a public school advocate, TEDx speaker, and author of numerous articles on school leadership. So thank you for being here with us. And we're hoping that as a way of maybe introducing yourselves to the group, maybe you can answer the question yourselves. What do you like to do for joy now as an adult? And what are some things that maybe you did as a child that you wish that your own children could do now? Genevieve?
Okay, me first. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you tonight. I am here in Wilton, and it's just a pleasure to talk to folks in Darien and spread the enthusiasm for this kind of work. So what I do for joy is get outside, which is, I think, what so many of us want our kids to do. I love to hike and walk in the woods, and we're so fortunate here to have such beautiful outdoor places to explore. So that's what I love to do. And when I think about what I did as a child that my kids didn't do, it's funny, I've thought about this a lot, and it's not so much that I didn't allow them to do the things that I did as a kid, like ride my bike to a friend's and spend the whole afternoon outside, and the same kind of idea of come home when the streetlights come on. It's that I structured their lives so there just was no room for that. They didn't do it. They just didn't do those things. And in hindsight, I wish I had structured their lives a little differently, but I'm here to help everybody else who still has the time to make different choices. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So first of all, it's great to see Genevieve again. It's always a pleasure to listen to her insights. And Georgette, I want to thank you, and certainly Emily, thank you, along with our guests who are here this evening. I'll be really brief about this. When I was growing up in suburbia on Long Island, it really was, mom kicked us out of the house after Super Friends were on at 7 o'clock in the morning. And we went outside with our friends. Everybody rode their bikes. You knew where everybody was because that's where the bikes were. And we were like feral cats. Whoever would feed us, that's the house we were at for lunch and for dinner. And then we played some tag, and then we went inside. So that's that would never happen right now where we are, not because we wouldn't allow it, but it's because our neighborhood just doesn't do that for a myriad of reasons. What I do now, we live by a preserve, so the more I'm outside, the more I'm in the woods. I just like to run, usually run away from something, but I do like to run often as much as I can. And I'll explain why, because there's a lot of science behind movement and what that does for the brain. And if you know me, my brain needs a lot. So the more I run, the better off I am.
Thank you. We want to take this opportunity for the audience to put in the chat, because everyone at this point has seen the documentary. Can you go ahead and throw in the chat, what is it that connected with you from the documentary? What were some of the questions that came up for you? What are some things that maybe you were unsure about? How do you even sort of implement this in your life? And while we're waiting for the answers to come in, I was hoping that both of you can also tell us a little bit about what drew you to this work. What was the reason that you began doing this work?
Well, I'll say that I had gotten involved with Wilton Youth Council because of my interest in youth mental health. And I actually was introduced to Dr. Peter Gray at a presentation in Darien that was hosted by the YWCA's Parent Awareness group. And so another person from Youth Council and I went down to Darien one evening and heard from Dr. Gray, and were just fascinated and really wanted to figure out how to bring this work to Wilton. One of the things he said that night was, a parent asked, well, what can I do at home? And he said, you know, there are things you can do at home, but this is something that really has to happen at a community level. It requires a culture shift. And so we came home to Wilton and thought about that for a long time. And then when we had the opportunity, we were able to launch our Free Play Matters task force to try to do just that. And actually, we then brought Dr. Michael Hines to town, and he was very inspirational in helping parents and educators understand the intersection between what parents can do and what schools can do. Well,
that was very kind of you. I did pay you to say that, so thank you for acknowledging that. In all seriousness, you know, I've been in public education for 25 years, starting as an elementary teacher, and the landscape has changed tremendously since I've been a teacher. I've been a superintendent for 11 years. I know it's hard to believe, but it's been 11 years. And in all seriousness too, I shadow students. When I first went to Patchogue Medford, which is highlighted in the film, when I shadowed elementary students, but I shadowed high school and middle school too, I noticed how there was a lack of, believe it or not, just like Play-Doh, crayons, Tinker Toys, you know, Lincoln Logs, kitchen sets, the things that you would think would be in every kindergarten classroom were non-existent. There were test prep books. There were getting kids college and career ready. And I wouldn't have known that unless I shadowed a student, or students plural. And the tipping point for me is when we went outside for recess. And I say this often because it's worth noting. We went out for recess, we picked teams to play kickball. By the time we picked the teams, it was time to go back inside. And I was like, this is absolutely criminal. This is absolutely crazy. And that's what actually turned me on to Dr. Peter Gray, his TED Talk, his book, Free to Learn. Sir Ken Robinson's books, his TED Talks, had a huge impact on me. And that turned me into, like, what are we doing? And so in PatMed, when we doubled recess, the fact that it was a news story just showed me how out of whack things were. You double recess and you're on the news and like 6 different stations. That's when you say to yourself, Houston, we have a major malfunction here. And so that's when the work began.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Absolutely. We have a few comments that have come in. There's one person who wrote that it was really interesting to see how fear and worry about our kids' safety has grown so much that it prevents us from allowing our kids to do so much. There was another person who wrote that it resonated with her because she had been a high school guidance counselor for 27 years in an upper middle class community, and she was horrified by the way that kids' lives are being scheduled every minute.
You know, Georgette, do you mind if I just comment on that? You know, and again, I'm going back to my shadowing experience of a young lady who took 5 AP courses, had an after-school club, then had a sport, and then had to do about 5 hours of homework, and she rinsed and repeated that schedule. And then we ask ourselves, why are our kids, and Peter would say this, more anxious, depressed, and suicidal than any generation before? I'm not saying that's the sole reason, but we have young kids, we have, you know, older kids who are hyper scheduled, that they don't have any locus of control over their lives. And that's incredibly important. You know, Lenore says this all the time, and so does Peter. It's like, you know, kids need to learn how to be independent. And if they're not, like, how are they going to succeed once they leave high school, college, and get into the real world? So it's a real disservice to not allow kids to fail, to not allow kids to have free time. And we've stripped that of them, whether it's a high performing school district or even low performing ones, because in the low performing ones, they're test prepping them to death, just like they are, you know, in the high performing ones. And I know that because I worked in both. So it's a pandemic of a different sort that does have a remedy. But the fear, the reason why I'm mentioning this, is fear is a major driver of all of this. And a lot of parents, I think, have misinformation, which is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a couple of people who have also commented on the concept of fear, whether it's fear about kids' safety, and so therefore the safest place for them to be is in these structured activities. Other people mention the fear of their child sort of falling behind, that if they weren't to be participating in these you know, sports clinics and activities, that somehow they wouldn't be able to then enjoy their sports as much because they would see their peers doing better than they are. And then another comment that comes to mind was someone saying, like, you sort of start off by having a this theme of, if you get into a good college, you will have a good life. And so from the beginning, this idea of college being the goal, and sort of that is what you need to sort of set your mind to. And all of this anxiety around, how do we help our kids be happy, right, and safe? And this is what we're doing in the process.
So, you know, Georgette, what strikes me is all of these comments are really rooted in fear. Fear that if your child doesn't go to the right college, they won't have a happy or successful life. Fear that if they don't follow a certain, you know, path, sign up for all the right clinics, they won't be able to enjoy their sport. Fear that they won't be safe outside. There's so many things to be afraid of. And I think sometimes we're afraid of the wrong things. So first of all, I think if we really stop and think about it, we kind of know intuitively as parents that if we make a lot of decisions from a place of fear, we may not be making the best decision, right? Either for ourselves, our kids. I mean, when we make decisions out of fear, a lot of important information gets lost. And something that I've talked to Lenore Spinesi about is, for example, we all know the risks of climbing a tree, right? You might fall, you might break your arm. What are the risks of never being allowed to climb a tree, right? Never having the opportunity to climb trees. I mean, maybe you don't learn to conquer fear the way Dr. Gray mentions in the movie. He talks about that. That's an important thing you learn. You learn to stretch your limits. You learn to challenge yourself. You learn to that you actually can take on a challenge. So how are our kids going to learn to be resilient if they don't have the opportunity to conquer those types of challenges and fears? So I think, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about each of these things, but the first thing I'll say that sort of unifies them all is we should maybe stop and examine our fears and think about how we can the first thing we have to do to make good decisions is calm our fears down. Challenge our fear. Are those things really a risk?
If I can add to that a little bit, that was incredibly well said. One of the things I try to do often, but maybe not often enough, is suspend certainty about certain things, right? And I say this in a way where I'm still trying to do this in a lot of different arenas. When I first started becoming a teacher, my thought was every kid needs to go to college, and if they don't, good luck. That is beyond obscene. We have many students, I don't care what school district you are in, not every student needs to go to college to be successful, or they don't need to go to an Ivy League school to be successful. So there's a lot of narratives out there that are incredibly untrue, but it's about keeping up with the Joneses, unfortunately, in many ways, whoever the Joneses are. And part of our responsibility in school districts is to say there are multiple pathways for success. And we need to really start educating parents and students about what that means. Marty Seligman out of UPenn wrote this incredible book after 45 years of research. It's called Flourish. So what does it mean to flourish in life? It's not about to be happy, because happy is fleeting. Being content is fleeting at some points. But flourishing in life is something that you strive for and you can embody after a lot of time. So, when you track some of our kids, however, you track them longitudinally after they leave in high school, they go to college, they have successful careers as corporate lawyers or whatever it may be. And then you ask them, what is it? Are you flourishing? Are you happy? Are you these things? And not all of them are. And sometimes when kids take an alternate pathway and you allow them to do this, you allow them to take risks, you allow them to follow their passions, God forbid, just like you wanted to when you were a young adolescent, it's okay for that to happen. And we don't give kids permission to do those things anymore. And that's a real crime. And I think that's a real symptom of this. It's one of the major spokes on this wheel, and it's a big wheel, but that's one of the major spokes on this wheel.
Yeah, as I was hearing both of you talking, and we started out part of this conversation about this idea of fear and how fear might be driving some of our decisions. And this idea that here we are trying to help our kids conquer fear, and yet it seems like the first step is really for us to conquer fear first. Right, that we have to model that for them, or that maybe if we let them sort of do what they're going to do developmentally, right? If we allow that developmental imperative, they're not going to be afraid to conquer fear. We're the ones that are doing that, sort of getting in the way of that as parents, right? We try to get around those risks by trying to structure everything. So let me ask you something. So are we talking about play for younger kids? I know that we've talked a little bit about, research for, and whether as adults, these kids are growing up to be sort of flourishing adults, or whether they're happy. Is play something that only little people need, or do older kids need play? Do adults need play? And what would that even look like?
Yeah, play stops after 10 years old. That's it. You're not allowed to do it anymore. It's illegal in 26 states. Yeah, I mean, listen, in all seriousness, I think the happiest adults are the ones who play in different ways, different shapes and forms. It's incredibly healthy. And again, Peter has that incredible TED Talk, and it shows you how it's part of our DNA. And when you suppress that, what happens? It's like holding a beach ball underwater. At some point, something's going to come shooting up like a solar flare. So we need to have those outlets of play. John, he's a medical doctor, John Ratty, has a great book. It's called Spark, if you haven't heard of it before. And it's very science-based as far as movement. So play doesn't have to just be exercise or playing kickball or whatever it is. You can be playing, if you're old like me, Parcheesi or board games or stuff like that. There's a lot of things you can do to play. But the problem is, I think over time, is that we don't take the time to do it. You have to be very intentional as adults, I think, to make time to play. And I think you can't feel guilty when you do it, like you're doing something dirty. Like you actually have to be very intentional with your calendar to do those things. And it's the same thing for kids. I was reading some of the comments, the hyperstructure of of kids in activities every single day. You know, Monday they're going to piano, Tuesday they're going to lacrosse, Wednesday they're doing this, Thursday they're doing that. Saturday, it's like, when do they get a chance to just sit on the front lawn, back lawn, and just look at the sky and do nothing, or to go for a walk? And believe it or not, as Ken Robinson would say, that's where creativity stems from. And so play and creativity and all those things that are incredibly important for the human condition to flourish, we need to allow those things. I mean, where I'm living right now, which I won't say, I'm looking out already on the fields. You have baseball, you have all those lacrosse, you have everything. 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, travel teams. They're going to different states when they're 6 years old. And I mean this in the most loving way. I would never do that with my kids, selfishly, because I don't want to travel with my 6-year-old, go into 14 different states. So, and again, I'm not judging. I'm just saying, when did this happen? How did this happen? It's the pendulum has swung so far in this direction, and I'm hoping at some point it could swing back to some sort of balance. Because Little League, I think, is good for kids. Little League competitively, you know, traveling to different states, and maybe not so much.
You know, I'll add to that sort of in a practical way as a parent. So it's hard for me to think Savannah, who everybody met in the film, I'm not sure what she did for play in high school. I can't think of any examples. So that's a me problem, right? I think I didn't open up those possibilities, and she was pretty busy, even with everything we were going through. But I think about my youngest child. My youngest child was much less scheduled. I think I had the advantage by then. I'd seen this whole thing from start to finish, right? I'd had kids graduate from high school and go to college. I had seen their friends graduate. And it really, you know, once you get to the stage I'm in now, my kids are in college or beyond, I have the big picture. I didn't have the big picture when my kids were little. I didn't know where all of this was heading. Now I know that, you know, there's so many different paths because I've seen my children and their friends follow them. So back to my youngest, by the time my youngest was in high school, I was a lot more laid back, and that child was a lot less structured and scheduled. And I know one of the things we worry about too is how much time our kids spend on screens. And there's a lot to be said about that, but I'll say this one thing. One of the things my child spent a lot of time doing on screens was learning how to sew and how to make costumes. And I think if Savannah had these interests, it would have played out differently. But with my youngest, because I was a little more loosey-goosey about the whole thing, it translated into my youngest child spending an enormous amount of time during high school creating costumes and sewing, and that was play. And that's not something I'm interested in at all. I have no interest in sewing. I think, you know, I was able to step back and say, oh, this is an interest this kid has that I don't get, and I don't really get where this is going. I remember saying, well, if you really want to learn to sew and you think you want to study costuming in college, we should sign you up for a class. And my kid was like, no, I'm not taking a class. I'm just having fun here. And you know what? It was great. It was play. It was self-directed. My child learned how to scope a project, how to scale the project back when it was too big and they couldn't do it. They learned an enormous amount of executive function skills, which later turned out to be very important in college. And you know, not for nothing, but they did work at the costume shop in college. So apparently they didn't need that class after all. Play takes so many different forms, and sometimes we don't get it. But if we just sort of step back and let it play out, and it may play out over years, and you still don't really know where it's going. You're not going to know where it's going, but beautiful things can happen.
That makes me think a little bit about what had been mentioned earlier about the locus of control that children need to feel. And I think as very well-intentioned parents, we see an interest that our child has, and we immediately want to promote it, foster it, you know, help them sort of be the best at it that we can. And well, again, that's a very sort of well-intentioned motivation. It makes me think about sort of a child going to a class and being sort of taught how to do it the right way, right? And that if you're investing time into it, therefore it's to be the best at it, right? That ends up being the goal, as opposed to the creativity and the imagination that is required when it's something that's very self-led. That's something that you're doing in your own time, that you decide whether, you know, this part of the YouTube video I may or may not follow. I kind of want to go do it in this way. And that's where they have that locus of control. That's very child-led, as opposed to sitting in a class and learning how to sew something.
That's exactly right. And you can still be supportive. You know, you can say, well, let me know if you need anything. Like, you know, we ended up with a lot of craft supplies at our house. And my kid did need a ride to Michael's. But, you know, you can be supportive without taking over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I can just add to, you know, we bubble wrap our kids, not once, not twice, but probably 20 times, because we don't want them to fail, not because we don't love them, but because the intentions are there. But it's incredible. It's an incredible disservice to them, where we want our kids to take risks and try things that they've never tried before, and to actually not do well, especially for our perfectionist students who are so used to doing everything and doing it once and being, you know, amazing at it. That's not real life. Over time, the law of averages will average out where they won't be the best at everything that they do. And the sooner they are capable of understanding that and taking that inward journey to focus on how to deal with those feelings when those things happen, that's really where play comes in. It really does. It allows them to navigate the landscape both inside and outside when it comes to those things. And so as adults, they'll be able to deal with those things. And that's really the beauty behind play, especially, as Peter would say, mixed age play. When you have fifth graders playing with first graders, God forbid, you know, everything is so hyper segregated as well. You know, you can't have fifth graders hanging out with kindergartners. That's like, no way. But no, that's like the best when you have those opportunities. Fifth graders model, you know, for the kindergartners. The kindergartners look up to the fifth graders like they're gods and goddesses. And that's how you learn. If you think about when you're in a neighborhood growing up, the third graders on the block just hang out with the third graders. I mean, that'd be weird. That's not the way it was back then. You learn from, you know, kids who were younger from you, kids who were older than you. And we need to bring those opportunities back to schools, so all the things we just talked about can happen organically and in real time, where it's not structured.
It's a little bit almost like the sibling relationship, right? Where the younger sibling looks up to the older sibling, and the older sibling also gets something out of it because they're also learning how to take care of someone younger and how to sort of mentor, in a way, someone along, which also brings with it a sense of pride. So speaking of, you know, sewing on YouTube and you know, spending time on screens, there's been a couple of questions that have come up about, you know, in this particular case, the use of screens was actually really beneficial and something that promoted creativity and play. But there's been a lot of parents that have been saying, like, how, you know, any free moment that my child has, he or she is spending it on the phone. That doesn't look playful to me. How do I get them off the phone? How do I get them to a place where they're actually okay sort of laying down and looking up at the sky and looking at the clouds? They can't. They you know, they immediately start saying, I'm bored. And then that's when I sort of jump in and start to structure their time.
I think the first thing we have to do is think about our own use of the phone. I'm glued to my phone. I have mine here, right here too. So, you know, we're all glued to our phones as adults, and it's, what are we role modeling, right? You know, I was lucky because I didn't have a smartphone when I was standing at the school bus stop in the morning for hours of my life. I think I spent many hours of my life, like all of us, standing at the school bus stop with young kids. If I were standing out there now, I'd probably be staring at my phone. I think a lot of people are. So anyway, that's the first thing. We can't really ask them to do something we can't do ourselves. So the challenge is the same for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would say, like everything else, it's about balance. How do you find that balance? when you go to the extremes either way, it's just not good for you. I usually say, if I have too much vitamin A, it becomes toxic. Too much screen time, too much anything is not good for you. So how do you strike that balance both within the school, especially during when the pandemic was happening and yet you had remote learning, and or when they're at home? It's about boundaries. It's about setting up, again, as Genevieve said, you modeling those behaviors. It's not going away. Like, these phones, these hyper-human computers are not going away anytime soon. If anything, they'll accelerate at some point. So we have to give our kids the tools so they can actually self-regulate when they realize that they're on something too much. If you're watching TV too much, you should know, right? If you're doing anything too much. So it's about giving kids tools to do that, and giving educators tools to know when they're on, the screen too much within the school day. It's hard to regulate as an organization, as a family. Again, what you want to do is give your tools that. So I think I've shared this, well, I haven't shared it here, but I happen to have one of my daughters has Down syndrome. And one of the things she loves to do is to watch YouTubes of this girl. I have no idea who she is, but she has this YouTube channel with her brother and they open up toys and blah, 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 right? So anyway, make a long story longer. It's good for her in small doses. It's not good for her for 6 hours straight. So we use it more as a reward. If she goes through the day doing the things that we expect her to do, that she's supposed to do, we use that as a reward. But it's not, the first thing she does when she wakes up in the morning and the last thing she does when she goes to bed. So, it's about trying to balance all those different things, which isn't hard. I mean, I'm sorry, which isn't easy. It is very hard, for sure. But I know parents can do it. We're trying to do it. And listen, my wife is an assistant superintendent. So you would think of all the families that are out there that we would be experts at this. We are far from it whatsoever.
One thing I think we have to remember is that kids, like adults, are using their phones to connect, right? So if we're not, we connected by going outside and playing with the kids in our neighborhood. There aren't kids outside in the neighborhood to play with. Kids still need to connect. And so if they're using their phone that way, they're craving connection, and we need to provide other opportunities for connection as well. So rather than fighting over the phone, if we can supplement in more things that are even more rewarding ways to connect than the phone, like being in person. Peter Gray, I remember in one of his talks, him saying that they surveyed fourth graders, I think, and said, would you rather connect with your friends like on a video game, or would you rather connect with them outside together? And they would rather be in person. And especially after these last couple of years, they really value being in person. But we have to allow time for that.
One of your comments made me think about one of the questions that came up about, there aren't kids in the neighborhood. And there's been a couple of comments about how do we, let's say I pull my kid out of every single activity that he's doing, every clinic. He'd probably be happy because every time I try to take him to these things, he's crying. Who is he going to play with? Because every other child is signed up for something. There's literally no one for him to play with. And I think it also makes me think about how many parents talk about and kids, I think even as boredom as something that you need to run away from. Right, that boredom is this sort of the intolerable feeling that as a parent, I have to take away from my child. I have to figure out how my child not to be bored.
Boredom is something as parents we have to get comfortable with. We do have to be comfortable with. Sometimes boredom is accompanied by whining and all sorts of other not fun stuff. And if we can sort of ride it out and empathize, then sometimes they can find their way through it. But Dr. Hines has he can share how to overcome this with play clubs.
Yeah, definitely. Before I discussed that, I'm so glad you brought this up, because boredom to me, is the cornerstone for creativity. It allows that time for students to think of things that they don't have permission to think of these things before. You know, one of the things I speak about often is I want our kids to be divergent thinkers. You know, if they see something in front of them that's a problem, there are multiple ways to attack that problem. And that's where I think where Play Club comes in. So one of the things we started in my previous school district, and we're starting now in my new one in Port Washington, is this before school club where kids would come together. The adults were trained not to intervene. So it was the complete opposite. If something was going down, we're saying to adults, listen, unless someone's like physically in danger, you know, or the house is on fire, do not do anything, even when kids come up to you. And it was very counterintuitive for those adults to try to do this. But after a while, these kids, what they would do, mixed age play. Again, you talked about students who would at first not know what to do. And then before you knew it, they were creating things that we never thought they would create before. And it actually, some of the activities were in the movie, which was great. And the teachers, and this is the most important part to me, it's qualitative, but it's important to note. The teachers knew who was in Play Club before they came to class. They can tell when the kids entered their classroom in the morning who was in Play Club and who wasn't, by the way that they were just ready to learn and to become active participants in the learning process. So boredom, again, this all stems from, it's like, you know, pickup games, or, you know, your friends meet somewhere and you're like, what do you want to do? I don't know. And you guys trying to figure out what you want to do. These kids don't have these opportunities anymore. So Play Club offers something like that opportunity. And by the way, it doesn't cost much money. You know, you're not going to sink a budget, you know, a school budget, because you want to have Play Club in your elementary school. But it's one of the ways to bring kids together, to embrace boredom, figure that out, what that looks like, and to do something that's incredibly impactful in a multitude of ways.
You know, Wilton Public Schools also have Play Clubs now in all our elementary school grades, and you sign up for it like you'd sign up for any other school activity. And that ensures, what Play Clubs also ensure, is that you have a critical mass of kids there. So, you know, there's playmates. Another thing that's happened in Wilton that I think parents can advocate for is Wilton Soccer Association has been really enthusiastic about the Free Play Matters Task Force, and they introduced a new recreational soccer program that incorporates a lot of free play principles, and it's mixed age play, and it's more like pickup soccer than it is like travel soccer. And it gives the kids a lot of self-direction opportunity for that type of thing. And it's been really popular and successful. So, you know, there are ways to introduce these opportunities through the more scheduled programs, but that's the world we live in, right? We can't just send them outside and say, play with the kids in the neighborhood if there's no one else there, but we can try to sort of plant opportunities in our communities that allow kids to have these experiences in our current culture. And then when we see the benefits as parents and educators and soccer coaches, then it spreads, right?
Mm-hmm. So both of you have mentioned a little bit sort of the, you know, trying to find that balance, right? Whether it's a balance with screen time, a balance with, you know, other requirements, and yeah, that we can't necessarily send our kids out to play with the neighborhood kids. And so this kind of looks like signing them up for yet another thing, but the elements of what they're signing up for is very different. So there's been a few questions that we've received about trying to find that right balance between over-parenting, over-structuring, providing that guidance so that your child can thrive, and yet on the other hand, how do you also just sort of let them go and let them try something out there was a question about, in the documentary, there was that little boy who was trying to negotiate with his mom about taking the train by himself to go see his father, and that he had to negotiate so much that it made this person cry. How do we know when our kids are ready for us to let go? Where do we find that balance between keeping them safe and letting them go? Not a small question, I realize.
No, it's like, what's the meaning of life? I can't think of anything harder than being a parent. And I mean that in the most loving way, or more rewarding. I have too many kids at home, actually. And I mean that, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding, Aaron. Of all different age groups. And I don't know what the answer is. Some of it is you just know. Some of it is being very uncomfortable with things that you don't want to do right away, but really think about and pause and allow them to happen. Like the other day, my 6-year-old wanted to make something on the stove. I was like, no, there's no way. And I'm like, you know what? All right, mom's not around. You know what? I'm gonna have. She didn't hear me. I'm gonna have you try this. And you know what? She made something. She didn't burn the house down. It didn't taste that good, but she tried it. And I didn't have a heart attack. But my first response was, there is no way. Because I'm like, I'll call CPS on myself if this happens, But that is, I think, when you get to the point where you're like, would I have done this when I was their age? Did I do these things? Did I actually mow a lawn when I was 7? Yeah, I did. Would I have my 7-year-old mow the lawn now? Probably not. That's when you have to say to yourself, I'm going to try something new and different with my kids, especially if they ask to do it. Instead of being Captain No about everything, maybe once in a while say yes and see what happens. I mean, when I was in Finland 4 years ago, and this is no joke, I know it's a different country, it doesn't matter. Kids who were in kindergarten would ride their bikes to school that were 1.5 miles away by themselves. And yes, the roads are busy in Finland. They're not driving on dirt roads. And I'm there and I'm at the schools. I'm like, are these kids actually riding their bikes 1.5 miles? Are they? And they have trees. Finland's like 80% forest. They're climbing trees like 25 feet, 30 feet in the air. I'm like, where are the attorneys? Are there attorneys under these trees? Is this happening? First graders, again, using real drills to make stuff. And I'm like, that would never happen here. So I think it's about, again, suspending certainty about certain things, that we want our kids to be safe and not saying no right away to some of those things. And that's something I think over the years I've been trying, but it's hard to do. And I'll end with, it's very hard being a parent. But I think once in a while you should say yes to your kids, actually more than once in a while.
Yes to everything you said, Dr. Hines. And I'll also add to that, Julie Lythcott-Hames has in her book a really great model. So one of the things I think to remember is that it's trial and error, but we also don't have to just sort of throw our kids in the deep end right off the bat, right? So if there's something they want to do, like say my kid wants to go to the city, take the Metro North to the city and tool around in town. Well, so maybe the first time we go together, and I did this with my kids. I'd say, well, show me how to get to where we're going, right? Like, you lead the way and I'll just follow you around. And once I'd followed them around and knew that they actually did know what they were doing, then the next time, sure, you can go by yourself because I've seen you in action. So we can, Julie says, do it for them and then do it with them and then let them do it, right? So you don't go from nothing to everything necessarily. And the other thing I think the movie illustrated so well is that oftentimes we really can't trust our kids to know what they're ready for. And one of the stories I love in the film is of Jack, who at first says he wants to go to his grandfather's in New Jersey and he wants to get himself there. But he later decided that he wasn't ready for that. And he decided to have the party at home instead. And he was ready for that and he planned the whole thing. So, his parents were willing to go with it and they were letting him figure it out. And in the process of figuring it out, he said, okay, not yet. So oftentimes our kids do actually know what they are able to do and what they're not. And if we talk it through with them, have them explain it to us how they're going to do it, they can figure it out for themselves if they're ready or not.
Yeah, I just want to add this real quick. So, and again, I talk about, us controlling our kids' lives from the moments they wake up to the moment they go to bed, right? We make every decision for them. So one of the things Erin and I have tried to do is allow our 6-year-old Abby to dress the way she wants to school. And let me tell you, the first 3 days are like, oh my God, I don't know if we can do this. Because some of the outfits she was choosing, I'm like, seriously? But we're like, you know what? Let her do it. And after a while, she figured it out all by herself, even though both of us are like, we can't do this, but you can do it. And I think from there, it just grows to watching them, again, flourish in their own way to figure this world out and navigate this world on their own. You're there to support. You're like a scaffolding. You remove yourself over time. That's the gist of what we want to try to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the idea of, finding opportunities to say yes. And that even though we may be sort of cringing at times, that it's really important to create a yes space for them, as opposed to trying to child-proof their entire environment, and that there will be times when it works out and other times when it doesn't. And that oftentimes when the kids can feel like they have that control over their lives and that they can do it, they can move on. They can move on to other things as opposed to sort of trying to regain control. It makes me think about my, I have a 4-year-old who at age, I want to say maybe 2.5, because it was pre-pandemic, decided that she really wanted to dress herself. But her concept of dressing herself was, weather appropriate clothes. And then she also wanted the bathing suit on top of those clothes. And I got a few comments from other parents like, well, there goes Lucia with her, her underwear or her bathing suit over her clothes. And, she eventually decided that just wasn't the cool thing anymore to do. And I think that if I had fought her on it, if I had really been, worried about what other people were going to say, she might still be wearing a bathing suit over her outfit. So, and someone just wrote in the comments that someone once told her that when she was having issues dressing her toddler, just saying, hey, at least she's wearing clothes, so good for you. So, we've talked a lot about almost like a mindset shift as parents, both within our families, but there's been a few questions in the chat about how do we create almost like a culture shift in our town? Because as it was mentioned in the documentary, it's not enough for just one family to make a conscious effort to change the way their children are overscheduled or overparented. How do you suggest that parents in Darien realistically start a community-wide culture shift? And how do we partner with the schools to find ways to integrate some of these recommendations into the school day?
I can tell you how we did this in Wilton, and it's sort of one model. We really came at this from a multi-layered approach. So we developed a task force. For us, it started with having Dr. Peter Gray come and speak to educators and people who work with kids. And for you, it's starting right now. And from there, we people who were really interested in this work, who included our superintendent and principals of some of the schools and a lot of parents and representatives from other organizations in town that serve children and youth. We formed our task force, and we had a very wise leader, Colleen Fawcett, who worked here at Wilton Youth Services for a long time, and she divided us into 3 committees. So we had one that was focused on families and neighborhoods and did a lot of parent education and sort of neighborhood community building at that level. And we had another that was focused on community organizations. So the Y, the Nature Center, youth sports, all of those kind of organizations. And then we had another that was working with the schools, and it involved mostly educators and parents. And so we were looking for opportunities across all of those areas to introduce these ideas. The parent and neighborhood committee was doing some parent education. They hosted or organized Wilton's big block party weekend, where we didn't actually host block parties for anyone, but we just said to everyone, why don't you have a block party on this weekend? And block parties are a great way to get to know your neighbors and to meet other children, other adults, people of all ages in your neighborhood. And you feel so much more comfortable sending your kids outside when you know your neighbors, and they're more inclined when they've met the other kids. They probably already know them from riding the school bus, but that was huge, that type of thing. And in the community level, all of these different organizations started trying to incorporate some free play concepts into the programs they were already running. We hosted a bicycle rodeo with the police department so that we were teaching kids how to be safe on their bikes, because you're a lot more comfortable letting your kid go out on a bike when you know they know the rules of the road. And then I'm going to let Michael talk more about the types of things that can happen in schools, but we had a group working on that too. And having all of those things working in concert is really very effective.
You know, the hardest thing to do, one of the hardest things to do is changing your mind about something. What's even harder is changing somebody else's mind. Right. So what you have to do is be incredibly deliberate as far as what your intentions are, and to make sure that you have research to back it up. So if you want to get to the heart of a school district, especially as a school leader or board of education, is to say how this will A, impact all students, B, it won't cost that much money, and then C, talk about the effect on a student, both academically, socially, emotionally, and physically. And so you start there, and it starts with educating the board, educating administrators as far as why this is a good thing. You know, so what is the overall effect? And the way you do that is through policy within the school district. So of course the governing body is the Board of Education, the superintendent is the chief executive officer. It helps when you have the board and the superintendent as a team of two moving that forward. If that's not the case, then it becomes a lot more difficult. But what parents can do is you start in a school with a principal who may be principled, ED, enough to say, this is something I would like to pilot in some capacity, whether it's in one classroom, whether it's in one grade level, whatever it may be. And you know who those principals are who kind of lean in this direction more than others, because it has to happen organically, at least at first. And what I did is I always show the evidence of why this works, why this is best for kids. You know, and there's a lot more of the people out there, even though the Holy Trinity for me is, you know, is Peter Gray and Pasi Sahlberg out of Finland, and certainly Ken Robinson. But the evidence is the book I just shared before, you know, Spark. If you have kids move often throughout the day, the evidence of them doing incredibly well academically and in other areas, it's through the roof. And this is written by a medical doctor with vignettes of other school districts around the United States to say how this works. And so parents, it doesn't have to be, you know, a whole community at first. It can just be a gaggle, I say gaggle in a loving way, of parents getting together with a principal to say, can you test drive this to see what it looks like? And then, believe it or not, once those seeds are planted, it's very hard to stop that from growing. But again, for me, it's all about policy. How do you implement this as far as school board policy to make sure that it stays put? But there's a lot of great information out there. And by the way, just talking about recess, you know, the CDC has been getting a bad rap for the past couple of years, understandably so in some ways. If you look at their research and the report that came out, I want to say about 3.5 years ago, about recess and the lack thereof and kids' movement and what hasn't been taking place, how federal prisoners have more recess time than third graders or kindergartners nationally, it's clinically insane. And so that's where you have to get to the heart of the matter is this, some of the stuff that's out there is just nuts. It just doesn't make sense. And I always ask myself, would you want this for your own child, Mr. and Mrs. Superintendent? Would you want this for your own child, even if you're older now, Mr. and Mrs. Board President or Board Trustee? So that's the way I would start within the school system, because it can change.
And as you've been implementing this in your own communities, what have you found to be the biggest barriers or challenges to making this shift in your own towns, and how did you address it?
Dr. Hines, do you want to take that first? Or?
Yeah, sure. You know, it's usually, I call it the Dead Sea Scroll list. You know, I always say, we're going to try this. And then they roll out the Dead Sea Scroll list of the top 10 reasons why you can't do it. Right? It's the list of, here are the reasons why this can never take place. And usually it starts with money for the most part. But the most important thing when it comes to all of this, you know, moving this forward, is that you need somebody, I believe, who's a real proponent of moving this forward. So for me, organically, it was, you know, I always find a principal. I would always find teachers. Teachers are the most important ingredient, aside from parents. Parents are first, teachers are second. You need parents and teachers who are really willing to try these things that are new and different. So for the barriers, the teachers can navigate through all the barriers internally. They know the inner workings of what they can do. They're like the custodians. You remember the Breakfast Club? The custodian knows everything about what's going on in the school. That's the same for the teachers. They know where all the loopholes are. They know how to figure things out. And so if you have teachers on board with you, the barriers can really, I believe, be melted away. And if you propose something that doesn't rob Peter to pay Paul, you know, where you're not taking away something to add something, and it's budget neutral, it's very hard, I think, for people to say no to it, at least to even pilot it. So you have to make it somewhat budget neutral. You have to have people on the inside who are willing to do the work. And I think if you have those ingredients, you can work through the top 10 reasons why this can never take place.
I'll add to that what I think as a parent, from the parent perspective, the things that that have been challenges are they come back to being rooted a little bit in fear, right? The perception maybe that this kind of philosophy runs counter to academic rigor, that maybe we're sacrificing rigor in favor of independence and play. And I would argue that the opposite is true, that play is a critical part of social and emotional learning for children, and that social and emotional learning is the foundation of all academic achievement, right? We have to be healthy and well and ready to learn. But it's making that connection for ourselves as parents, and kind of overcoming that fear that, you know, maybe our kids aren't pushing hard enough. And the other one, which was we alluded to earlier in one of your earlier questions, which is the idea that our kids are going to fall behind, right? That if we don't schedule them in as many classes and clinics and teams and activities, they'll fall behind. And I get that. I mean, you might remember in the film, I mentioned that there came a point for Savannah where we had to step down the rigor of her coursework because she couldn't do that for herself. She felt so much pressure. She said, well, you know, I'm smart. I feel like I should take advantage of all these opportunities that I've been given. And finally, a therapist said to me, you have to make that decision for her and step down. Now, she was in a more crisis, right? So not every child, you know, sometimes you're going to be able to do this more together with your child rather than you sort of laying down the law. But the fact is, in the end, what are we worried about them falling behind? Like when we say that, what do we even mean, right? For example, one of my kids said, Savannah decided to take a gap year between high school and college. And one of my younger kids said, well, I would never do that because she's going to get behind. And I was like her friends will be working for 1 year when she starts working, for the rest of her life. So we worry so much about getting behind, but we don't. If that's another thing we need to examine is, well, maybe if our child is crying, and I had that experience too, crying on the way to practice, crying on the way to the activity, and we step it down, well, then maybe they aren't going to play at such a competitive level by the time they are a junior in high school. But is that a big loss, or is that just maybe not their path? So for parents, that's what we just have to sort of get beyond some of those things that those assumptions that we're making, that we're getting those messages from the culture that these things are important, and we have to sort of take a deep breath and say, well, are they important to me? And are they important to my kid? Sorry, I'm starting to babble.
No, not at all. Georgette, real quick, I want to add this point because I think it's something we don't do enough as Americans, because, where we live, we look at what's happening locally, regionally, maybe nationally. But it's rare that we look at what's happening systemically in schools internationally. So, for those of us who have been around for a while, in 2000, there's something called the PISA test. They test 15-year-olds around the world in math, science, and language. And when you look at, the countries that ranked near the top, Finland, believe it or not, and some of the other Nordic countries were near the top. Never teaching to the test, by the way. And when you look at their school systems, first of all, the school year is shorter. The school day is shorter. What gets them up in the morning is totally different than what gets Americans up in the morning as far as what's happening within the school day. You have Finns, kids who are speaking 2 to 3 languages by the time they're in 3rd grade. By the way, they have recess 4 times a day. 4 times a day. So not everything is about academics. It's about other things that take place within the school day. And we have to reimagine and reframe what the purpose of education is, what the purpose of being a child is. And if we can do those things, which I think we can, we have a much better shot than changing a classroom, a school building, a school district. This is something I think that is scalable, but it really does start with the parents believing that it can happen. And I don't know if parents can, because we've been conditioned to think that it has to be a different narrative.
Or that in order to be a good parent, a reflection of how good a parent we are is dependent on our child's quote unquote success, right? But at what cost? And what is the impact on a child's mental health if we were to continue in this way? And that was one of the questions, is how do we change course? How do we recognize when our children are feeling so much pressure, when our children have themselves internalize this definition of success that's just measured in terms of their academics or their sports or something that's equally difficult? How do we change course?
Well, it's this concept of balance again. I mean, I think in our house, my husband and I went from kind of seeing our role as parents as being, we thought our job was to help them be the best they could be. And then we shifted that understanding of our job and started to understand they're getting that message everywhere. So our job at home was to be a counterweight to that. Not to say don't be the best you can be, but to say, how much of this is realistic for you, and how much is comfortable, and how much can you take on and still be happy and healthy? Like you said, my happiness is fleeting, but healthiness hopefully is more enduring, right? And resilient is hopefully more enduring, resilience. So, it's different with different kids, and I'm not going to say it's easy. So, Savannah really appreciated us stepping it down and taking some of that responsibility off of her. One of our other kids did not appreciate it. We did it anyway. And she felt for a long time, she was probably, she was well into college before she was able to sort of understand why we made some of the choices we did. I mean, we would say to her, you can't do everything. You can take, you can take, however many, we would sort of set a limit on how many honors and AP classes she could take and how many activities she could do at one time. And she did, it was tense. I'm not going to say, oh, she was like, thanks, Mom, for taking good care of me. That's not what she said. But she was unhappy. And even though she would not say to me, she would not say I'm anxious and depressed, I could feel it. She did not seem to be thriving. She wasn't filled with joy, right? None of us are filled with joy all the time, but it didn't feel good. And so, you really have to sort of feel your way along. Different kids are different. But you have to trust your gut a little bit, that if something feels off, something's off. And you need to evaluate that and figure out what your values are and how you're going to try to stick to them. And even if it means being the heavy, and even if it means not being very popular. Now, some people can do it different ways. Another person I heard said, well, you could say to your kid, okay, you can take on as much as you want, as long as you're getting 8 hours of sleep a night or whatever it is. But, you have to find the strategy that works for you.
So, it makes me think about a young woman. I mean, she was 16 at the time, who was, I'm a clinician by training, and she was being brought in for treatment. And, parents were understandably very concerned, AP honors, the straight A's. And she was, when I asked her why she was being brought in for treatment, she said, because my parents think I'm depressed. And they think I'm insane. It's like, well, why is that? It's like, because I told them that I want to opt out of the rat race. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not happy. I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing, but this just isn't what I want to do with my life. And so now they're really worried about me. But how do I help them understand that continuing to do this is not going to make me happy? And that this isn't like a symptom of depression, that I'm going to start giving away, all of my interests or give up all my interests. It's not that. These weren't my interests to begin with.
Right.
It was just something that was giving me an edge.
Right. Well, and remember, Savannah said in the film, I thought it was okay if I wasn't happy now, because I'd be happy later. But what kind of life is that? Just always waiting to be happy at some point in the future.
I remember when I gathered all our AP students this is a crazy meeting, and maybe we can end with this because this is very telling. So I wrote this article about the College Board that I thought it was just a money-making machine, prompting kids to take AP courses to get college credit and then graduate when they're 20. And then they get a job when they're 20. It's just the most ridiculous concept I've ever heard. And they have to pay, by the way, to do this. Anyway, make a long story longer, I had about 250 AP kids together. And my one question was, would you take 5 or 6 AP courses and skip lunch if the grades weren't weighted and your GPA wouldn't be increased? It's like taking a regular course, like taking an elective. And you would have thought I shot the Pope in the Pope Mobile. It's like, really? Why would you ask that? Of course we wouldn't. So you have to ask yourself at some point, what is the purpose of all this rat race? It's like the Matrix. You can take the blue or the red pill. It really is like those Captain Obvious commercials. It's incredibly obvious, but it's still, we don't see it for some reason. And so there are things I think we can do as parents. There are things we can do within the school system. But if we don't do it together, it's never going to change. It can't be one or the other. It has to be both working together.
Absolutely. So as we come to the end of our evening, I was hoping that for our audience, if you can put in the chat, what are some changes that you want to make in your home or in your community? based on tonight's discussion, based on the documentary, based on what we've been talking about tonight, any ideas that you have. What do you want to walk away with? What do you want to change? And what do you think is standing in your way? And as we're sharing that in the chat, I also wanted to share that for parents who are interested in continuing this conversation, we'll be sending out a sign-up form in tomorrow's follow-up email, where parents can actually join a book group of Lenore Skenazy's Free Range Kids, and how parents and teachers can let go and let grow. We're also, I see that Emily has also put in the sign-up form in the chat. So please go ahead and click on that if you're interested in joining us. And we also wanted to let you know that our next event for the Thriving Youth Task Force is on Wednesday, May 4th at 7 p.m. And it'll be on gender differences and youth mental health. And so please join the Thriving Youth Task Force and guest presenters Olivia Bucci, LMSW, and Andrew Tepper, LCSW, for a discussion about gender differences and youth mental health. I see a couple of people that have been commenting on wanting to go home and really take a look at overscheduling and helping their kids really decide, you know, why are we doing this? Why are you doing this? Is it because something you love, or because you think that this is something that's going to help you sort of further down the line, but it's not something that you're really enjoying right now? So thank you so much for everyone who came here tonight. And thank you so much, Genevieve Eason and Dr. Michael Hines, for joining us tonight and being a part of our panel.
Thank you. We really appreciate it, Georgia. Thank you.
And I just want to say congratulations to Darien for having the conversation.
Yes.
There's so much reason for hope. There are resources out there, and there is so much possibility. And you can do it. You can.
You can.
Thank you, and everyone enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.